In 2021, the concept of battling structural racism and settler colonialism is the main topic permeating through the spheres of mainstream liberalism, anarchism, and left communism. Critical race theory has been crafted by the minds of bourgeois professional academics such as Mary Matsuda, affiliated with the University of Hawaii Manoa Law School, and Robin DiAngelo, University of Washington, and she is the author of the book White Fragility, with their theories relative to how the dynamics of the capitalist system have historically favored those with a lighter skin complexion compared to others who do not have the same complexion. Without any reasonable doubt, this theory does hold true. I'm not going to argue against the theory. However, there is also a lot of context missing. And by a lot, I mean a lot. Without the establishment of context, distortion and manipulation relative to theoretical concepts that are supposed to aid in the cultural and economic emancipation of the historically marginalized and oppressed can also unintentionally be used to harm and further atomize the very same people such theoretical concepts were meant to help. With greater emphasis and examination placed on criticism relative to the materialistic foundation of the United States, relative to land theft, indigenous genocide, and founding fathers fighting the British to preserve the slave trade, and nothing at all about, undermining monarchy rule or anything about that. No. Radical liberals, anarchists, left comms have embraced a very simplistic and one-dimensional view relative to the struggle against structural racism in very plain terms that pit non-white people against white people. And this contemporary strain of theory is directly tied to bourgeois academia. Any criticism, even constructive criticism, of the contemporary strain of liberation theory will be automatically branded by its adherents as someone who is practicing white fragility and upholding the structures of colonial oppression, even if criticisms come from practitioners of orthodox Marxian social conflict theory. Automatic reaction to constructive criticisms are unhealthy and unproductive in terms of developing a synthesis to dismantle structural white supremacy. Let me propose this question to the liberal critical race theorists now. If a person who is perceived as white reactionary is not considered to be white enough to be admitted entry into the very real and very legitimate white supremacist groups such as the KKK or the Aryan Brotherhood, are those people who are being attacked white, or are they lesser white? If literal white supremacists have an explicit definition of what constitutes as white supremacy, that has very little bearing or relationship to how liberals and bourgeois leftist academics like Robin DiAngelo frame white supremacy, yet there is a shared overlap that attacks the same people for being too white and yet not white enough. Are the liberals unintentionally siding with the white supremacists, or are the white supremacists unintentionally siding with the liberals? How whimsical is it for the Ellis Island stock to be attacked by both white supremacist groups for not being white enough to live in a land that their Calvinist Mayflower stock ancestors stole from the indigenous, and yet at the same exact time be attacked by the radical liberal practitioners of critical race theory, calling them colonizers, when for the most part the Ellis Island stock did not have any ancestry linked to the origins of the United States relative to the Mayflower. No links to slavery, no links to indigenous genocide, no links to the American Revolution, no links to the Civil War even, and who themselves were descended from peasants that escaped the brutally autocratic rule of very white kings, queens, kaisers, czars, and popes, only to come to the United States to have their labor exploited to make Anglo-American robber baron industrialists, think Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and later the Bush families, whose private interests are what the United States military state also works for, insanely wealthy. Coincidentally, these are also the same industrialists who themselves and their children would later intermarry with, with the same tyrannical inbreed European aristocracy, who are all related to each other, by the way, that was directly responsible for launching crusades into Palestine for about 1,000 years, establishing colonialism of the Americas, aggressively facilitating the transatlantic slave trade to undercut the Ottoman Arab slave trade, which was also occurring at the same time, ushering indigenous genocide, driving tens of millions of their peasantry out of Europe to the United States, and have tens of millions of more of their peasantry die in holy wars and a world war when aristocratic cousins had land disputes or religious disputes among themselves, and who, interestingly enough, are the same class of ultra-Anglo-bourgeois aristocrats who provide funding for the university systems, foundations, and nonprofit organizations that advance this bourgeois leftist rhetoric that places blame for all the sins of the past on the now reactionary Trump-supporting petty bourgeois and reactionary working-class Ellis Island stock, whose complicity was bought and sold off after World War II, and who now embrace anti-globalization positions, when not even 100 years ago, the ancestors of the former slave-owning ultra-bourgeois Anglo-aristocracy were scheming up eugenics programs to eliminate the ancestors of the very same Ellis Island stock, whose kids were bought off by this American dream fantasy, while African Americans and Latin Americans got left behind. Instead of attacking these confused and historically illiterate Trump-voting Ellis Island stock Italians, Eastern Europeans, Irish, and anybody who else is Southern European or Catholic or Jewish, instead of attacking them and calling them white and colonizers, instead put them on the defensive and ask them, why did you sell out your ethnicity to be accepted by a class of Anglo-Americans who enslaved and murdered our ancestors, and who also wanted your ancestors dead as soon as they came through Ellis Island? Help us get our land back and our reparations, because your people were once persecuted and exploited too, and you forgot about it. Other than the absolutely disgusting and atrocious reign of King Leopold II, for the tens of millions of African lives that were butchered and lost in the Congo, when will the radical liberals ever blame those very, very white European aristocrats and Anglo-American business people at the very top of the pyramid of capitalism for all the problems that we have had in the past, currently have in the present, and will continue to have tomorrow if they do not come to their senses and place the blame for structural racism where it actually belongs? Structural racism is linked to finance, insurance, and real estate, fire industries as they are termed, all owned by unapologetic Anglophiles, by the way. What a coincidence. Back in the mid-20th century, Robert Moses, with the aid of fire industries, was bulldozing entire functional multi-ethnic neighborhoods in New York City and replacing them with highways and public housing projects. 500,000 people were displaced, and guess what? It happened in every urban center throughout the country, by the way. Ellis Island stock folks were allowed entry into the suburbs, living that fabricated American dream, and Latin Americans and African Americans were left behind in underfunded housing projects and urban ghettos, while fire industries simultaneously outsourced industrial and manufacturing jobs and artificially stoked racial anxieties. They would actually pay off not gangs, but actors of people of color to stage fights in front of white homes to get white people to sell their homes. They did that to make a profit. Then, oh, what a coincidence. A couple decades later, the AIDS epidemic and the crack epidemic happens at the same exact time and disproportionately affects BIPOC and LGBTQ communities at the same exact time. And establishment shills, both left and right, say there wasn't a coordinated effort facilitated on a public and private level behind this unpronounced genocide, as I term it, that occurred in urban areas throughout the United States in the 1970s and 1990s. Now, the establishment shills will say, that's a conspiracy theory. Now, in the era of urban gentrification, the reverse is happening. Racist policing happens because the police work for the real estate industry and multi-billion-dollar corporations that profit from structural racism. What more, neighborhoods that get gentrified and people that get displaced are instead supplanted with Starbucks drinking, yoga practicing, professional class, typically white, but not always, liberal yuppies and techies who at the top of their lungs support defunding the police, anti-bullying campaigns, fighting climate change, open borders, supporting land back, supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting trans rights, and every other trendy progressive cause that comes down the pike, and will quite smugly lecture the unlearned, unwashed, uncultured, unenlightened, reactionary Trump-voting masses as if everyone who doesn't think exactly as they do must be a fascist or a racist or a Trump supporter. About being an ally, recognizing white privilege, white fragility, intersectionality, making every case and every excuse in the world to convince long-exploited BIPOC communities who they priced out of their neighborhoods, by the way, that all working-class white people are racist and fascist, when these smug-ass, yuppie, professional-class liberals don't seem to realize that they themselves are the beneficiaries of the very same structural racism that they supposedly want to dismantle. Which takes me back to the subject of European aristocracies and monarchies. Why do I put such an emphasis on supposedly harmless and ceremonial institutions occupied by a bunch of wasp inbreeds for tourists to fawn over? Because they are not harmless and they are not ceremonial, they are toxic and they are functional. While not operating officially on a political level, they operate through finance and multinational corporations that are tied to their imperial and colonial assets. They like to offshore in the form of money laundering operations in extra-legal jurisdictions such as Monaco, Grand Cayman, Vatican City, the City of London, just to name a few places where multinational corporations and multi-billionaires collectively stash away trillions upon trillions of dollars worth of capital under the protection of the monarch. Well, what does that have to do with structural racism? The liberal asks. Oh, you don't remember what I just said a few moments ago about, slavery and colonialism and genocide, how they're directly tied to European monarchies? You don't remember that? How many European monarchs, popes, kings, queens, emperors in the past 1,000 years do you know of that weren't white? Oh, that's right, none of them. That is literally white supremacy. How many of you are familiar with papal infallibility or divine right theory, which currently existing states with nominally constitutional monarchies in 2021 still adhere to? Basically, this means that the monarch is chosen by God, does not have to answer to common law being God's chosen representative on earth, and by this ridiculous medieval construct merging church and state, European monarchs enjoy diplomatic immunity, do not need passports to travel, cannot be arrested, cannot be prosecuted, cannot be sued, and can exercise extra legal powers with discretion, keeping their hands clean, while others serving at the pleasure of the monarch do all the dirty work. in addition to retaining the wealth that their ancestors and predecessors, in the case of the Pope, looted, plundered, and stolen off the billions of people who lived and died under European colonialism and imperialism. This is the whitest of white privilege and the whitest of white supremacy. You had all these leaks, Panama Papers, Libor, Pandora Papers, implicating the highest people in the highest places. That's going to get all swept under the rug, if it hasn't already been swept under the rug. Hey, Jeffrey Epstein, who was about to spill the beans on Prince Andrew, mysteriously dies. No one knows what happened or how it happened, and it gets swept under the rug. You know why? Because European monarchs, who are the very definition of white supremacy, who maintain colonial and extra-legal banking entities that harbor tens upon tens of trillions of dollars worth of capital extracted by American billionaires and their financial and real estate corporations stolen off the blood of the exploited, are guilty. They are guilty. You want to dismantle systems of structural racism? Go after the most backward, archaic, and racist institutions that have existed for the past 1,000 years, which are European monarchies, upheld by a fabricated bullshit divine right theory, which they supposedly has no power. They have no power, despite having more power than you would ever know or can comprehend. In closing, if we are going to address systemic racism and dismantle such, we need to reject the directly racist conservatives who hate all working people, no matter what their race is, even if they're off-white Ellis Island stock. We also need to reject the indirect white supremacy of liberalism that has, for time immemorial, co-ops liberation narratives and pits people of different ethnicities and genders and sexual dispositions against each other to protect the upper levels of capitalism that are more racist than you could ever possibly know or dream of. We have to continue the Ellis Island stock, or we have to convince the Ellis Island stock that they are not Anglo-Americans and that they need to stop shilling for Anglo-American bourgeois nationalism, America, which did enslave Africans, which did commit genocide on the indigenous, which did commit all sorts of other genocides and war crimes all over the world to benefit the private interests of the Anglo-bourgeois under the banner of the American flag. Lastly, we need to bring up the subject of dissolving and dismantling European monarchies back into the discussion. They are not harmless. They are not innocent. They are very complicit in laundering, harboring, and profiting off of the crimson-covered accumulated wealth extracted via American imperialism and corporate globalization that exploits and oppresses all. You want to dismantle structural racism? That's how you do it. You don't do it by being an infantile, contrarian automaton regurgitating bourgeois pseudo-leftist talking points that you learned at UCal or NYU, diverting away from the source of the actual problem, and derail actual leftist organizers who are attempting to develop a synthesis that challenges the source of the problem. You want to attack white supremacy on the internet and be an internet social justice warrior? Go on to Minds.com. That site is chock full of those people. But if you really want to trash the fash, you got to be like Lenin and take down the crown first. Because without a crown to bankroll the fash, to bankroll the fash, there won't be any fash for you to trash anymore. Okay? This is Comrade Pella signing out.